The next time he was in 1957, after he took command of the 552 Missile Battalion. He had several incidences in the desert. One of them is a cave that the GI showed him that was there, and it was always animals, had water in the cave, and it was a cool place to go out of the desert. And often many of the men would go up there, and himself, on just for excursion and something to do. You got to understand, Red Canyon is very isolated from there's no stores or anything around. They built a church there, which I think was highly interesting. Later on, there's a story that involves that. But anyway, he went to this cave, and when he was in the cave, he tells the story of the first meeting with the alien in the cave. Do you want me to go into detail on that?
Yeah, this is really important.
He said he was kind of laying back, sleeping, relaxing, dozing off, and all of a sudden he rolled over and pulled his gun. They always wore their gun whenever they were off their post up there. And he pulled the gun and he pointed it toward this form, he says. He didn't recognize what the form was. So he asked, he says, friend or foe? The form said neither. But he was very, very upset because the message came mentally, and he figures, how in the heck is this thing, and what is it doing? He later sees it move a little bit, and he sees that it has a type of helmet on with a type of stone in the center of its head on a band. He drew pictures of it, or had an artist draw it. This creature asked him to shut down his radars for 15 minutes. He says that he figured in his head, how does this thing know that I'm the only person that could give that command to shut these radars down? He asked the creature, well, why should I do it, or what's in it for me? The creature answered, a new world if you can take it. At the time, that had little to no meaning to him. Only in later days did it have a meaning to it. He went out of the cave, called Sergeant Rexack, told him to shut down the radars, and he says that as he was leaving the cave, he sees the creature standing in the end of the cave, and he does kind of a gesture with his hand, which wasn't a salute or wasn't a wave or anything, but he saluted it back. And that was basically the end of the encounter there. Later...
Where did it go? Did it go into a ship, or...?
No, he never said. He never said. But later, he's on his radars, they picked up, this is the same year, 57, and I don't know the exact date, but he left 12 hours of film that gives exacting details. They picked up a ship moving over 3,000 miles an hour through the atmosphere. It went down near Red Canyon. So he had a light airplane then, and he got the pilot. He flew up, looked around, and he saw a shiny object on the ground. He figured that he would investigate closer by himself, so he landed, did not take anybody with him, got one of the old staff cars, went out into the desert, and he says he found the craft. And he says it was perfectly smooth. It was oval shaped, more like a cigar than a saucer, stuck into a side or resting against a rock sideways. He said this thing would fade out completely and then fade back in. He thought he was hallucinating, and he couldn't figure this out, what was going on. He was scared to death, he says, but he managed to take a tumbleweave and throw under it when it was faded, when it was gone, just to see if he was hallucinating or if it was real. It came back again. He says that he touched it. It was cool to the touch on the side. He says when it disappeared again or went back out of phase again, the tumbleweed was crushed, so he knew it was physical. He said there were footprints around the craft. I always felt like there was more there that he hasn't told, just my personal feeling, because you don't see footprints in the craft, I don't think, without having a second encounter. But that's my own personal view. He says the ship began to vibrate. He says he got scared. He jumped back in the staff car, threw it in reverse. It went flying backwards, and he says the motor stalled. He said he saw the thing rise up, turn, and go up into the air, and then it went into an envelope that it kind of imploded into. And he says later on he told von Braun about it, he told Olbert about it, which were on his scientific teams later on. He knew them because he was in charge of Operation Paperclip for President Eisenhower. So, you know, this is a man of credentials telling a story like this. My wife and I always said this story is bull, you know, are we to believe him? And this, I must say this about my father. When you see his presence on film, and if you knew my father for only a few minutes, he never would change his story. He would never make the fish longer. When he told the story, he would tell it in front of anybody. He didn't care who they were, credibility, credentials, or whatever. He would tell it the same as he would tell any other story about MIAs or so like that, or, you know, such. They would do research for the White House. They were part of Operation Paperclip. They would do research on, for instance, if you want to know one of them, my dad was a declassifying officer on, his Project Horizon. See, President Kennedy really didn't do such a great thing when he said we're going to send a moon landing by whenever it was, 1967, or whenever he promised us, or the end of 1969. That had actually all been proposed in Project Horizon. Obviously, I would say that the president probably knew about this because it was classified at the time. Later on, when it was put into the book, my dad was the declassifying officer on that, so he knew it was to put on. I remember seeing that as a boy by accident. I picked it up on his desk one day, and it was about an inch thick, and it had all color photos in it. And I said, wow, look at this space stuff, you know. And of course, I didn't know what it was, if it was a fiction book or what it was, but I do remember seeing it. He speaks of a man named Wilbur Smith, which was a great investigator of UFOs and phenomena, and built a lot of machinery for magnetism and, you know, along the Tesla lines. That was Canadian. He was disgraced. Dad says later on, Dad exchanged medals with him in the 60s. Of course, Dad has discussed this issue with many politicians. He discussed this issue with, of course, Strom Thurman. He discussed this issue with the CIA Director, J. Edgar Hoover. He's
the FBI.
FBI, I'm sorry, yeah. He discussed this also with CIA leaders. I don't know who they were, but he says really all branches of the services and the intelligence community. He briefed several of the chiefs of staff. They did keep the information from several presidents. They figured that they just did not have the matrix to be briefed on this subject. One was Carter. He would never know, they said. And there was actually a group of about 30. Now, don't pin this number to an exact number, but he said it's about 30 key generals and key military and key congressional people, such as he briefed John McCormick, Speaker of the House. I was actually under his patronage for a while. I worked on Capitol Hill as a Capitol policeman and as a page. And he briefed these people. He briefs Senator Strom Thurman. Another congressman that Dad was very close to was John Feehan from Ohio. He briefed him. Why did they brief these certain people? It was part of my dad's agenda and others at the time to keep knowledge and secret and to let knowledge out in certain areas. And this was more or less a community of friends. There were many generals involved in this, and their pack was the last to die could tell. And the last that did die, you're blinking red, the last that did die was, of course, General Trudeau. And then my father told everything after General Trudeau. But if you notice, there was never a word said before 1992. My father was on the National Security Council he wasn't, now this is a part here that becomes, Freeman raised a question, and it became very controversial when it should not have been. My father was not on the council. but he was an advisor to the council for the president. In other words, there's many advisors that sit in on council meetings and they just sit back and take notes and then report back to the president. As far as being listed as part of the council, no, he was not. And why a big deal? Well, let's not go there. It just wasn't necessary. But to answer your question, I'm going to tell this in my words. These weren't exactly my dad's words. I tried to keep his words pure, but it went something like this. Eisenhower, he says, asked him where these creatures were from. I'm speaking of Roswell. Dad says, we don't know. He says, what do they want? He said, we don't know that either. So Ike, he said, well, Corso, what's your opinion? What should we say about it? And Dad says the answer to Ike was, look, we're old military men. Let's just say nothing. But it did penetrate our airspace, so we have to treat them as foe. And so the cover-up, or whatever you want to call it, began. My father says there was never a cover-up, never intended to be a cover-up. But with all these agencies, and with the White House not wanting to say anything, it certainly shortly got written into mandate to be a cover-up. And that's how my father says, for instance, the government doesn't need to cover itself up. It's so inefficient, it'll do it itself. But as you can see, this is developing a pattern. It wasn't just chance that my father was put in research and development in 1960 under foreign technology, because this is now the second time in the government, or second time that since he was in the career, you might say, from Fort Riley to Eisenhower to General Trudeau. This was no accident, because you can see that Eisenhower was also another very important president that had this information and knew of this information.
About Jack Kennedy, what did President Kennedy have?
My dad says he knew of the information. What type of technologies and how were they transferred? I go back to where Dad first inherited the file. The file General Trudeau had brought up as soon as he took his job. Had it brought up from the basements of the Pentagon. This file had a lock on it, just like in our website. We tried to duplicate it. That's a 4-drawer, and it was a 3-drawer he speaks of on the films. It had materials in it. It had classified files in it. It had files on the Philadelphia experiment. It had files on many other government issues besides Roswell. But it did have some artifacts in it. These artifacts, my father said, there was actually a file that briefed where the artifacts came from, and it was indeed Roswell, 1947, July 4th. And these artifacts were, he speaks of laying 3 of them on a triangle on his desk, and General Trudeau walking in and saying, oh, what's that junk on your desk? You know, and Dad would say, well, you know, these could change the world. And General Trudeau would say, yes, I know, and we just hope that people that come afterwards will know what to do with these. It first was a piece of metal, and this metal was kind of different because it couldn't be penetrated, folded, creased, or sealed. But when they sent it to one of the laboratories, I remember Dad saying they put a certain frequency and current to it, and it became transparent, and it passed energy through it, and it could be cut and destroyed in. Another object that he had was the first integrated circuit. More than an integrated circuit, though. It was a wafer, a multi-stacked wafer with a kind of a prom window in the middle of it, partially burned on one end. Now, this is the interesting part. My father says by him concentrating on that, he could make it glow. It would glow a blue light. He also had fiber optics laying there. They didn't know what these things were. They figured they were wires of some sort, but didn't know how they operate. The interesting thing that shows you that we have not achieved a point of where these fiber optics are is my dad would also hold them in his hand, and when he closed his hand around them, the ends would be glowing. So this means they contain their own energy. So, you know, we haven't reached this state yet of understanding how materials can atomically align and become, you know, opaque and such from that. One of the things that General Trudeau did say to my father, though, was after they analyzed the metal, was that an alignment of atoms, anytime my dad had any hint of it, he would take the team of Olbert and all of the Germans and scientific team and go to this facility instantly, because General Trudeau said that would be bigger than Los Alamos. There were other items. He spoke of an item that was moved over the human body that went to either John Hopkins or Walter Reed. He never saw it again. He said it also couldn't be opened such. He had the first laser in his hand. They didn't know what it was. And he tells a story on film that he thought it was a flashlight and the batteries were dead. So he had no idea what this thing was. But when they put it to Fort Belvoir and they put the energies and currents to it and this and that, the first laser appeared. But he says that the characteristic of this laser is nothing like we have today. It was molecule size. He was sorry he wrote the book. He was sorry he exposed the family to the ridicule, to the lawsuits. It's been very tough on our entire family. He did not want to die, leaving us with these problems. We were very fortunate to find an angel, a true angel, in Mr. Kent. If it wasn't for this man, I certainly would not be sitting in this front of this camera now. Just hope that the future people such as yourself and me will know what to do with this type of knowledge that this man brought forward. I do say that he is the first man to come forward in a high capacity, and possibly it will start to snowball going down the hill, getting larger and larger. I certainly hope so, because I'm sure then he would be looking down and be proud of us. Of course, the paramount company would be Bell Laboratories. As most of you know about the lawsuit between American Computer and Bell Laboratories, and no previous history of inventing the integrated circuit. Now, let me set something straight for the record. I'm doing like my father did. I must be a product of him. The transistor is an Earth invention. Okay, and people say, yes, it did come in 1948, began this research on it and this and that. It has nothing to do with the integrated circuit, except for that it is solid state and it did begin the technology. And as they would plant some of this technology, such as night vision, they would plant this technology into areas that were already existing, already working on these areas. For instance, there was an infrared night viewing device or such that came from German technology at Fort Belvoir. Well, that would be the natural place to take the lens from one of the aliens' eyes. And Dad says when they held it up in the hallway, they could see movements in the background of soldiers or people moving and such. Now, it again contained its own energy, nothing like we have today. So they planted these R&D projects in already existing. Now, they didn't implant the artifact. That's a big misconception too. They gave them a procurement, they gave them the funding, they gave them the what to develop toward, and then they would insert from their own laboratories certain knowledges to keep them going on the right path, to keep them developing. And if it took the artifact to get the final product, they did this. And it wasn't being done benevolently. It wasn't being done. It was being done for the Army's own advantage over the other services and over our enemies and such like that. There was no, reason that the public deserved it or the human beings or kindness or such like that. It was strictly a military operation. He says that the Air Force had this material from Roswell, the ships, actually at Edwards Air Force Base, and that what they had was simply materials that were thrown into a Jeep. The reason he knows that, it was in the briefing file, in the file cabinet with the artifacts. So
what the Army had was just thrown into.
That's right.
But the main craft.
That's right. It was a few scraps.
But the Air Force had what?
Had the entire ship, the remainder of the ship.
And where was that located?
Edwards Air Force Base. Now, Dad didn't tell that except for on his deathbed. I guess it's clear it was still classified. He had 9 levels above top secret. He was still, almost to his dying day, you could see him wavering between, sometimes he would say something and I would come back to him and he'd say, no, I never said that. For instance, he found a key. They couldn't get the ship opened up. So this is how I knew he was still in contact in later days, because they could not still analyze the ship. They had no way to open this ship. And he told me after he had his first heart attack that there was a key that they inserted and lines, seams came out everywhere. Let me go to this part to answer that question of what the extraterrestrial looked like. You know the alien autopsy film? He was often asked if that was real. And he says, well, he can't testify whether it's real or not, but he says, let me tell you this. From an intelligence officer's standpoint, there's 3 items that whoever faked this film, if they did fake it, could not know. Number 1, there was no lymphatic system. Number 2, it had 2 brains, 4 lobes. One of the brains was laced with ICs. Of course, that was not in the film, but it did have 2 films.
What's an IC?
Integrated circuit. The other part is that it had 3 eyelids. It had the outside one that was removable, had a membrane, and then the eyeball. So Dad says, whoever faked this, if they did fake it, had the same report that he had from Walter Reed. By the way, the autopsies were done at Walter Reed. He said that the EB was indeed part of the craft, integrated into the craft, and it was the propulsion system, lack of a better word. There's really not a science to describe how the craft moved, but he said they knew it was integrated into the ship, and so were the other occupants of the ship, part of the guidance system, so on and so on. The ship was a living entity also.
How did he know that?
He knew that from the reports. They knew it died. It simply turned from blue to brown and died like a fish out of water, and so did the occupants shortly after. Now I'll tell you something about also the EB. He often spoke of a room in the Pentagon which you had like a jail door, and you slid it back and you went in there, and you were not able to take any pencil, paper, recording device or so, and you simply viewed documents, and then you came out with whatever you could store in your head. Once or twice, it led me to believe that there was something else that was kept in those rooms that would give information. He had a thread also that was from the clothing, and he says that the ship's skin, the alien's suit, silver suit, and his skin were all similar material. Absolutely, he was aware of other crashes. He says that the Germans told him that they had a crash, and that's where most of their technology and their advanced materials and their research as we brought them here. And this was, part of a team that he worked with every day. He said there was another crash in 1957 in Corona. They knew that it was Stalin's #1 mandate to steal Roswell technology. So they began a operation to hide it. They felt that the CIA was infiltrated. They felt that their funding would be cut off. And they felt that there would be nothing done with this material if they did indeed leave a paper trail or such like that. Our family was shocked. I mean, we absolutely, were in disbelief that he could keep this a secret all these years. My mother would not be the type to even listen to anything like that. I'm sure that he didn't. I'm sure he never told another soul. Except for people that were in the loop. He says that this group of 30 that were in charge of this technology, he says it wasn't a written mandate for them. They were simply hardened battlefield officers, and they had an oath among themselves. So I guess men that you die next to and that you fight next to, that oath is probably just as good as if you signed it with the Lord. So I know my father never talked to anyone about this stuff. I'm positive. He told me many, many times that there were no borders and have not been any borders. He say him and others that were in charge and political, they knew by 1983 we would become a user country. And that means we would consume about 90% of the world's goods, and we were a fattened cow and would keep consuming it. This is the way the economic system is set up. He schooled me that he was taught by 2 popes the meaning of money. That was a deal he had worked out with them for doing certain favors for them Father O'Flaherty and two of the popes. Pope Pius, I think, the 12th and John the 5th or so, but don't quote those. I'd have to look in his records to see that. No, I was always a product of his schooling without me knowing about it. And now I see why. Maybe I have a job to do. He knew of this, yes. He knew of MIAs, Korea. He knew quite a bit about Vietnam because, of course, him and Trudeau were going to go there. They were one of the candidates to take over the job. Yes, the world is entirely different than most people think it is. That came in later days when he told me that, after the book. He says the Vatican is indeed a very knowledgeable source. My dad knows of the MIAs that were left in Korea and why and how they were moved to Russia, and he testified on open and closed Senate committees on this. He says that the main reason that this was done is, of course, because of our liberal views, our sympathizing with communist doctrine during the time, blackmail. And it's in my father's writings in detail.
And we did nothing.
Did nothing. Right now, there's no civilian machinery to handle another crash. If it happens again, it will simply go to the military, and it will probably be the same situation that happened in Roswell. Even though the time is different, I don't think the military agenda is any different. It will come under national security, and it will probably be the end of it. I think that we need a movement that we, as people of the earth and people of the universe, that if a ship does crash here again, which my father said will happen, that we can be in charge of that or have salvage rights. My father, after the book, he never knew John Glenn, but for some reason, I guess he thought he was very important. So he made a trip to Washington. There was another reason he made the trip, to see Jean Dixon. She was very sick, and he went in to see John Glenn. And he gave John Glenn a document on an automobile, lightweight automobile. Now, whether it was a lightweight, impractical, or whatever, I don't know the entire, but John Glenn, he gave him the brief on it. It was about 1/4 inch thick. And it was from one of the laboratories that was funded. This is one of the items that came out of the Roswell crash that no one knows about until right now, except for the people that actually built and were in on the secret project. But someone might ask John Glenn if he remembers my dad's visitation. I think it was in '98. They would absolutely put the end to anyone that does that. That is something that has passed through many generations of our government. Not to be done. In fact, even Teller was good friends with my father, and they knew that also. How they knew it, I don't know. But he did make that prediction, and darn if it didn't happen. During the Reagan administration, I think when SDI was started, that it was a, he told me later, you know, after '92 when he wrote the book, he says that that was a planetary defense system, and that leaders of the world, most of the leaders knew that at the time. See, the Cold War, talked about as a Cold War, and he says the meaning was that it was an extraterrestrial war. He says they were terrorizing terrorizing citizens and interfering with military facilities. And I would say...
And he saw a military solution to that?
Well, the planetary defense system, which is SDI. That's also a hint I had that something was up. I didn't understand it at the time, what a planetary defense system meant, but I had a good idea reading between the lines.
I said, "What do you need?" And he said, "How many hermetically sealed infant caskets do you have, 3.5, 4 foot in stock?" And I said, "We don't have any." "How long would it take you to get them?" And I said, "Well, I can call Amarillo by 3:30 this afternoon and have them in here in the morning." I said, "What's going on?" He said, "That's not important." I said, "Well, it is important also, but anyway." And then I hung up.